idea that the fentanyl crisis in America is not an emergency is so appalling to me that I'm sure that when we appeal, that this decision will be overturned. If there are little hiccups here or there because of decisions that activist judges make, then it shouldn't just concern you at all. And it's certainly not going to affect the negotiations, because in the end, people know President Trump is 100% serious, and they also have seen that President Trump always wins.
That was the head of Donald Trump's National Economic Council laying out the Trump administration's case to appeal a ruling by the U.S. Court of International Trade, which struck down the president's tariff regime late last night. And appeal they sure have. Tariffs are already temporarily reinstated by another court just this afternoon. Here to dig into how the legal fight could splash back on Canada is our front bench. Former BC Premier Christy Clark is with us. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Former interim Conservative leader Rana Ambrose is here. She's the deputy chairwoman of TD Securities. And rounding us out this evening, the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief, Robert Fife. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you.
Hi.
I'll start with you because we just talked to Derek Burney, who, of course, helped with the initial NAFTA negotiations, then consulted quite a bit on the last one. He made an interesting point about, look, this may be a sign to be even more cautious if you're Canada. Like, there are forces in the U.S. working to push back against this as a trade policy, and maybe take that into account as we embark on negotiating a so-called deal with the United States as well. Do you think that will have an impact on the way we kind of govern ourselves?
Well, not when you listen to the Prime Minister. He seems to be saying that we want to wrap up an agreement with the United States as soon as possible, perhaps before September. And this, in fact, though, may help the government's position with the United States, because the Trump administration is facing, I mean, that was a hell of a decision that came down. And it's very unlikely that other courts are going... You're gambling that other courts are going to agree with Donald Trump, given the fact that the judges on this court are experts in the field. So it may actually push the administration to cut a deal with Canada and cut a deal with Mexico, because they've got so many other big files on their case, mainly China, but they also have Europe. So I think there's a possibility that there could be an agreement. And why am I saying that? I think it's because there's been such a cone of silence that's been going on in here with the government about what is actually going on in terms of the talks with the Americans. We know Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc was there all of last week. Do we know anything that went on there? No, we do not.
And it's the Americans telling us they're there.
The Americans are telling us that they're there. And the fact that the Prime Minister has invited the President of Mexico to the G7 summit in Kananaskis is also an indication that perhaps they want to do some kind of a deal or get some movement on the tariff with the Americans, because they're going to be together with Donald Trump. So I'm not saying that, because nobody can predict anything but Donald Trump, but I think that we may not be seeing something that is actually happening underway that could mean perhaps an agreement a lot sooner than anybody expected.
What do you think, Rana, are the most important metrics by which we might judge that kind of a framework for an agreement or an agreement with the United States? Because when I spoke to the U.S. ambassador, the newly minted U.S. ambassador last week, he indicated like he didn't think there was any way it'd be no tariffs, but we might get the lowest tariff regime of any of the deals the U.S. makes. Should that be acceptable to us?
Look, I think that we should forge ahead with an agreement as quickly as possible. I hate to disagree with Derek Burney, but this international tribunal, the Court of International Trade, that found the three judges that found that they didn't believe there was a connection between using the emergency powers of the president to impose tariffs and the emergencies of fentanyl and immigration. They don't see the connection there. We all knew that. We get it. But now the pause lasted no more than 24 hours and tariffs are back on until at least they figure this out at the administrative level and at the court legal level. But remember, the president has other means to enact tariffs. He's still using Section 232, which is on aluminum and steel, and that hurts us. We need to get to the table and negotiate those tariffs away. And also on auto parts, we need to get to the table. That affects jobs in Ontario. We need to get to the table and continue to negotiate on that. But there's also something called Section 122 and Section 338, and this is all really boring. But he can use Section 122 and 230 and 338 to impose tariffs. He can, if this doesn't work out in the courts for him, he can just move. So insiders in Washington say to me, the courts might win the skirmishes, But Trump's going to win the battle and the war on tariffs. So we know there's going to be a tariff. And of course, we want to get to an agreement where there is no tariffs within the USMCA and it's fully, truly a free trade agreement. We might lose out some American content or Canadian content in North American autos. We lost a bit last time. We know he's coming after that again. We know he's going to come after dairy. We might have to figure out a way to do that and compensate dairy farmers and open up more access to our dairy market. And the digital services tax. We know the Americans want that gone. And then in exchange for that, there's things like the defense, rebuilding our defense industry. The Americans are the ones with all these prime companies that have the means to sell us the equipment that we want and that we need. But Prime Minister Carney just said in his speech from the throne that he's looking to Europe to rearm, to join a European pact. And that might be a leverage that he has. So I thought that was a really interesting thing for him to throw into the speech from the throne. So I hope negotiations are going on right now. I don't actually think we should pause or we should hesitate, because even if he loses this court battle, he has other means to impose tariffs on us.
Yeah, and I think Rana's point, Christy, is well taken, that, I mean, even in the best of times, what the courts say don't seem to matter a lot to Donald Trump. And he seems very intent, no matter what, regardless of courts or other opposition, on using tariffs as a means of trade policy. What is your view on how, what that should impart or inform on our own strategy?
Well, I entirely agree with Rana that we can, first of all, I agree with Bob that you can't understand and try and predict Donald Trump. Second, that they will find a way to do this because the system in the United States is so diverse in opinion, and there's so many different bodies that can weigh in on the opinion. I do think. If negotiations are going on now, it's a great sign, as Bob noted, and also, the part of that that's important, I think, for us is the things like digital media, or the digital tax, like supply management in agriculture. Those things have been bugging the U.S. since we did the last agreement. So the idea that we might be just talking about the same things at the end of the day that we've been talking about, except for, some new tariffs that we haven't seen before, is a pretty major downsizing of the threat that we had originally thought we might be facing. But I think from a political perspective here, the move is to say, we're going to keep doing what we have begun to do, which is we are going to diversify our markets. We are going to have something to sell to the world because we're going to simplify the permitting process and make sure that our tungsten and our copper and our gold and our oil and gas can find its ways to our allies around the world, that we can build defense pacts around that with our allies outside North America, and we will become a country that is no longer so dependent on the United States. That's been Carney's plan, I think, from the very beginning here. And if we can stick to our knitting on that, it'll take some time, and it'll be a little painful for Canada because you have to spend money, in this case, to make some money. But I think it's worth it in the long term for Canada to have more customers that pay more for what we have, and to be able to create probably the millions of jobs that ultimately could flow from that kind of policy decision.
Yet certainly what we hear from the government as far as what their overall strategy is. I think you're right, though, Bob, to point out like how quiet it's been is a point of interest. Because if I think back to when we were negotiating the original NAFTA, we were there every day, going live to the exact room that Chrystia Freeland was walking into to negotiate with Peter Navarro and all the people who were involved at the time. Like, this seems very different.
Oh, it's look, I've been around long enough. I remember the free trade talks with the Americans, and we were able to cover these issues when Simon Reisman was negotiating with the Americans, and the same thing on the NAFTA deal, and the same thing in the renegotiation under Chrystia Freeland. We were able to talk to people in the Prime Minister's office, in the trade office, as well as foreign affairs, and we were able to get a lot of information. And the Americans were fairly forthcoming, and lobbyists and business groups were forthcoming. Right now, you can't get any information, and this is
and
really.
If you can't get any, then none of us can. Yeah.
And it's really. Well, that's true. Actually, but it's really held closely, and that's often a sign that there has been progress that is being made. And we all hope that is the case, because we got to get this off our table. We got to move on with other major projects, what we need to do to diversify the trade in this country and get our productivity up. And the sooner, and I think from the American perspective as well, it makes a lot of sense for them to try to get an agreement with Canada and Mexico, because we're such closely integrated, and there's such a deeply integrated economic relationship that it would allow the president to be able to have a win and then deal with the biggest issue, frankly, is not even Europe, it's China.
China.